Education is so important. We see a patient with pneumonia. They don't have to understand the pathophysiology of pneumonia to get better. They've just got to know they've got to take the antibiotics, pace themselves, and they will get better. But if you've got someone with anxiety, they have to learn about anxiety in order to get better. I love trying to teach things and trying to teach things in a succinct way and a way that involves images. A reel on Instagram has to be 90 seconds or shorter. And actually, that was a really good discipline. Think, right, I've got to say this in 90 seconds. If I can say it in 90 seconds in a reel, probably that's something I can incorporate into a consultation. If I was asked, I wanted to evaluate how good an organization was, and I was only allowed to ask one question, I would say, how good are they at dealing with complaints? Your best defense from complaints and litigation and unhappy patients is to communicate really well.
Welcome to Dr. Erwin Kwun podcast. Today I'm joined by a special guest, Dr. Martin Brunard, a GP with over 2 decades of experience, and he's also an educator and author. He recently wrote The Worry Makes Sense. Hi, Dr. Martin. How are you doing?
Hi, Owen. Thank you. I'm very well. Thank you very much for inviting me.
I'm looking forward to dive deep into your story. And if you're a GP trainee, you're worried about exam, you have anxiety, this would be an episode you don't want to miss. So tell us a little bit about your background, Martin.
Yeah, I'm GP partner in my practice. I've been there the last 23 years, and I still do 6 clinical sessions a week. And my the thing that's always interested me in general practice is education, particularly teaching around the consultation. And so I've been a trainer for most of those 23 years. And then for about 10 years, I was program director on the Guildford GP training scheme. Really loved interacting with all the trainees there. And then in teaching the consultation, I sort of, without really intending to, I ended up coming up with a model, a way of thinking about the consultation called the two houses model. And that led to my first book, which is this one, GP Consultation Reimagined, a Tale of Two Houses. And it's so I stepped down from my role as a program director in 2019 in order to write that book. And then since then, I've done quite a bit of freelance teaching. So I often go to different VTSs and teach the trainees or teach the trainers about just a, a way of thinking about the consultation. It's quite metaphorical, use quite a lot of imagery that people often relate to quite well. And then more recently, I've been very interested in mental health and the education side of educating patients. I've been doing quite a lot on social media, mental health posts, ended up somehow with quite a big following. I ended up with 180,000 followers, which has sort of surprised me somewhat, but I really enjoyed doing those posts. And that was all partly in preparation for this book, which got published last week, well nearly 2 weeks ago, which is more for the general public, to try and help them make sense of their anxiety. So hopefully, we'll spend a bit of time talking about that, but that's me in a
It's quite fascinating to see how your career has progressed and how you're touching other audiences now. So let's dive deep into the communication, doctor-patient communication. So
yeah.
the message of the book, the GP Consultation Reimagined, which is a breath of fresh air for people who are learning consultation, because many of the other textbooks are quite logical and it's not as creative as yours. So tell us a little bit about yours.
Yeah. I mean, I was brought up on Roger Neighbor, and I think we do have a huge legacy of some great texts on the consultation and looking at what we do in this strange thing, the GP consultation. Um, and the one of the challenges with some of the books, one of the reasons why I really like Roger Neighbor was there are only sort of 5 checkpoints he talks about, which I couldn't remember. Some of the others are just, very good, but so meaty, I couldn't remember them in the consultation. And it struck me that I work well with images and metaphors rather than sort of academic theory. And that ultimately every consultation can be just boiled down to 2 goals, really. We can often have tasks that we're trying to do. I have to build rapport, I have to do ice, I have to safety net. And sometimes those tasks can kind of get in the way of a more natural communication with the patient. When actually, you can boil down all consultations to 2 actual goals. Think of them as goals rather than tasks. It doesn't really matter how you achieve those goals as long as you achieve them. And ideally, you're achieving them in a very natural way. And the 2 goals are to work out what matters. to the patient, so you understand what's important to them, but also as the doctor, you bring your expertise to the problem. So you work out what matters to patient and doctor, and then together you decide what to do about it. And actually, it doesn't matter whether someone's come with an infected fingernail or depression or chest pain, whatever it is. If you can work out what matters technically and to that patient, and to together decide what you can do about it, you've done a really good consultation. So the two houses model basically uses the two metaphors of two houses. I call working out what matters the house of discovery, where we discover and work out what's important. And then the second house is the house of decision, where we decide what to do about it. So I look at those two metaphors, and then that gives you a lot of imagery as to, well, what are the challenges in achieving those two goals? But I like the fact that I can remember two things quite well.
The book actually talks about different rooms, and for people who likes to think about memory place and orient themselves with the spacing, it might be helpful. So tell us a little bit about the different rooms, Martin.
Yeah. So in particular, if I just explain about the two houses, because the different rooms are particularly in the house of decision. So I imagine the house of discovery as visiting the patient's own metaphorical home. So you're very much on their turf. You're working out what matters to them. They understand, if you think about your actual house, you know how it's laid out. A visitor doesn't know that. We're visiting their house. We're also visiting their house again and again. In other words, we see the same patient again and again, and we gradually learn what matters to them and what their priorities are in their story. So with the house of discovery, I more talk about some challenges in exploring that house. And then the house of decision, it's not our house, but it's our turf. So house of discovery is very much their patch. House of decision is our turf. And we can imagine ourselves like a tour guide taking the patient around this house. And so the contents of every room in the house will be things that we could do, decisions we can make, actions we can take. So say someone comes with shoulder pain, there'll be a room marked painkillers, another room marked my explanation of your problem, another one physio, another one wait and see, another one scan, x-ray, refer to a specialist. So the contents of that house will depend on the problem. If they come with depression, the contents are going to be totally different. But there are types of room within this house of decision that we need to negotiate or be aware of. So, for instance, the first room we tend to come to is the high-tech room where we explain stuff. And you pretty much always, when you've worked out what matters, the next thing you're going to do is explain what you're thinking and what maybe you think is the diagnosis or about treatment. And that's a room we always have to go in. How do we do that without overloading the patient, with using the right language, with not just confusing them with jargon? And then some of the other rooms in that house are not rooms we automatically go through, but I talk about 6 different rooms. So the high-tech room, optional rooms, locked rooms, hidden rooms, empty rooms, and room 101. And some of those are a bear trap that you can fall into, and you just need to recognize. So one example would be an empty room. An empty room is a room where the patient thinks there's something valuable in that room, an action or something that's going to help them. But as the doctor, we know it's empty. So someone who thinks an MRI scan is going to tell them what the cause of their back pain is, when actually it's obviously not a nerve entrapment. And there's an MRI is just going to be a waste of time. Or antibiotics for a viral cough. The patient thinks it's valuable, and they want to get in that room. And what we often do as doctors is we say, oh, you don't need a scan, or you don't need antibiotics. In other words, you can't go in there. And we end up just having a big fight over the door to an empty room. And maybe there are better ways of doing it. So I use that sort of metaphor to help people avoid some of the traps that we tend to fall into as GPs. Yeah.
So time management is a common challenge that trainees face, especially when it comes to the exam with only 12 minutes. So have you got any tips for trainees who struggle with taking too long history?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a really interesting one. I think there's what it's like in real life, and then there's what it's like for an exam. So in real life, very often, what really makes you stretch out the time is when a patient comes with a list of multiple problems. And therefore, early on, one of the things we often need to do is look out for communication cues. We'll often talk about psychosocial cues we're meant to pick up, but patients will drop communication cues. For instance, they'll start by saying, the first thing is, or there's three things, or, I've got a list. In which case you need to find out what the whole list is. And then you need to set an agenda with the patient, say, well, okay, I think we could do these two things today, but I wonder whether we might need to book in another time. That's not likely to happen in the exam. So if you're doing the SCA, it won't generally be about a list that causes you problems. What I often see in trainees when I've done SCA prep, and I was involved in running an SCA course for quite a while as well, is I think they'll often be so worried about missing something in the beginning that they just put off and put off and put off getting to the end. And they'll quite often ask questions more because they feel they ought to, rather than because they really want to know the answers. So it's almost like they're preparing the main course for the meal, maybe or MasterChef, and they're doing every last little refinement, putting every sort of equivalent of a cherry on top and getting it all as perfect as they can, and they can completely forget they've got to do the pudding. So they just use so much time checking this and checking that, when actually once you've worked out technically what you think's going on and you've listened to the patient, you're probably ready to move on to the next bit. You don't have to get the first bit perfect to do the second bit of the consultation when you're doing the exam. So I think that's a bit, and I often think we really need to be succinct with the questions we ask. Very often a good question is only ask questions where you really are interested in the answer. And sometimes trainees ask questions because they just feel they ought to, but actually they're not even listening to the answer. They just think, oh, good, I remember to ask that question. Or they just go down blind alleys and checks, where they really don't need to know what, explore this extra alley. We have to be a bit like detectives in general practice, I think, and ask questions because they're really important. Whereas in the hospital, where our training starts, you ask all the questions, don't you? You're meant to ask every question. Then you do a systems review and just ask loads more questions. And it's trying to really think like a GP, but it's challenging.
It is challenging, yeah. And that fear of missing something is quite high when you're in an exam setting. So tell us about when somebody transition from data gathering to clinical management. What are the steps you would advise them to take so that it's a smooth transition?
I think ask yourself, have I worked out what matters to the patient? And have I done technically enough to understand the problem? So, and then when you've done that, work on the plan together. So very often it feels very competent to just come up with a plan and present it as a fait accompli. And yet very often we make the best plans when we say things like, well, one option here is that we could arrange some x-rays. How would you feel about that? Or I was wondering about physiotherapy. And you then leave a gap and the patient can come in rather than just, right, I'm going to refer you for physio. So trying to work with the patient is so much more competent. It's so much more rewarding. And what you don't then do is just say, right, here's the plan. So for instance, one of the types of room in the House of Decision I talk about is optional rooms. So optional rooms are rooms where you could go in that room and use the contents of that room, but nothing harmful is going to happen if you don't. So for instance, someone comes with back pain and anti-inflammatories, ibuprofen would be an optional room. They might well want to take anti-inflammatories, but they might not be interested. And the danger is we're so sort of linear sometimes in our plan. We think, well, the guidelines say 2 weeks of anti-inflammatories before you go for physio or whatever else. And so the trainee might just go into the anti-inflammatory room. And actually, there's quite a lot to do in that room. If you're going to prescribe an anti-inflammatory, you need to check, have they got any allergies? Do they have asthma? Are they on an anticoagulant? Is their renal function okay? You're meant to talk about long-term cardiac issues. Do they need a PPI? You can spend quite a lot of time in that room and then just confirm that it's safe to use anti-inflammatories. Yes, so I'd like you to take ibuprofen or naproxen for the next 2 weeks. And then the patient just goes, oh, I'm not really a pill popper. I can live with the pain. I just wanted to know what was causing it. In other words, they've stood on the threshold of that room, just too polite to say, "What are you doing in there? I don't want to go in that room." Um, and they've waited till you finished, and then they finally told you that you've been wasting your time. So often, one of the analogies I talk about in the book is open the door and have a look. So you imagine yourself actually opening the door to the room marked painkillers and have some phrase in your toolkit um, that allows you to have a look. So it might be, would you like to talk about painkillers? How do you feel about taking painkillers for this? And I'd really encourage all doctors, but particularly trainees, to be so intentional in the phrases that they use and be ready to change them. So, for instance, one tool that was in my toolkit for years with musculoskeletal stuff was, have you taken any painkillers? It's a reasonable question. We're meant to say, have you tried anything? The trouble with that is it sounds a bit like, well, have you taken any painkillers? Have you bothered? Have you tried? Have you done your bit before you came to see me? And that wasn't what I intended. And so only in the last few years, I've changed it to, have you wanted to take a painkiller? Because that allows them to say yes, and they're not touching the sides, or no, 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 I don't like taking painkillers. And it tells me so much about whether I need to go in that room. If they say yes, they're not touching the sides, I'm going to have to go into a room marked painkillers and talk about what their other options are, or explain to them there aren't any other options or whatever. But um, so things like that, we're finding the questions that you ask. And even here's one I would definitely encourage your listeners to put in their toolbox if it's not there already, um, which is often when we come up with a plan, we say, is that okay? And the trouble with is that okay is the patient can only say yes or no. And when they say yes, maybe they just didn't have the courage to say, no, that's not okay. And that's why often they go away with a prescription and never cash it in. Um, but if you say, how does that sound? They can't just say yes or no. And if they're on board with the plan, they'll go, yeah, that sounds great. I'm really happy with that. In which case, you get a pat on the back. You know you're on the right track. If you're doing the exam, the examiner sees you get a pat on the back. That can't be a bad thing. But it's easy for them to say, oh, I'm not sure. I'd rather not take painkillers, or I wonder whether I could try and lose some weight before starting that blood pressure tablet. So just even that, how does that sound, or how do you feel about brilliant tools to stick in your toolkit?
Absolutely, yeah. And commonly, sometimes when trainees are a bit stressed with the time, they feel like they'll just ask a leading question and try and rush for it, and that's a problem. Sometimes I've heard people say, "Are you following me?" Or like, most patients are very uncomfortable to say to a doctor, "No, I'm not following you," or "I don't
Yeah,
understand this." But it's
yeah.
better to phrase it, and the word does matter. Like, changes the subtext and communication that you're expressing. So thank you for highlighting that. Now,
Mm,
when we talk about communication, there are different ways of communicating. Sometimes you might have anxious patients. Anxiety is a big problem. So how do you
mm.
communicate with an anxious patient?
Yeah, interesting. So one of the things, again, be really intentional and be intentional with things like tone and pace and nonverbals. So, for instance, if I have a very anxious patient, say someone's even having a panic attack, I will slow down what I say. I will drop my tone a bit. I will just do everything to make myself sound calm and feel, and give them a confidence that there is a calmness here, and remove the level of threat, because they're in a high threat situation. They're seeing threat everywhere. And very often before they've heard my words, they're responding to my tone. So again, I think as GPs, in the best possible way, when we go to work, we're often acting. And it's not that we're pretending, but we're in a role, and very often you want to use all your acting skills to help the person and help change the situation that you're in. And that's with things like tone and nonverbals. Um, it's like, some of the simple things we say early on. So, for instance, someone who's anxious very often feels quite foolish. People will often say to me, um, I know it's ridiculous, or I know I'm being foolish, but I get really anxious doing this or that. And that's why my new book is called Your Worry Makes Sense, because actually it might seem foolish that you can't go to the supermarket because nothing actual harm, no one's going to threaten you in the supermarket. Very unlikely that you're going to come to physical harm. So people feel foolish about it. And yet, if you know you're probably going to have a panic attack when you go to the supermarket, then it makes every sense that you avoid supermarkets. So you only scratch beneath the surface of anxiety, and it's actually makes a lot of sense, and it's very logical. And so if we can help people to understand that. So, very early on, just saying something like, I'm really glad you've come about this. You know, there's plenty we can do. We may not sort it out in one go, but this is a start. If they say they feel foolish, you might say something like, yeah, anxiety often makes people feel like that, but actually it's not foolish at all. Take something like obsessive compulsive disorder symptoms. Patients will often have had all sorts of people just tell them they're stupid for turning the light, turning all the appliance off and unplugging the kettle before they can leave the home, or checking the door's locked 3 times before they leave. And on the surface, it seems stupid, but if we can say the opposite, then that can be really, really very powerful. And learning, it just amazes me how therapeutic that relationship with the GP is. I think we can often think, well, the only thing I can do about anxiety is prescribe and refer for therapy, and we forget how powerful. I mean, I think it was Balint talked about the doctor as drug, and just seeing the doctor. You just see someone, walk in a bundle of nerves, and if they've connected with you and felt validated and that you've listened, you haven't solved their problems, but they just go out with hope in their eyes, and that's very rewarding.
Absolutely. And I believe that words can heal or
Mm.
it can harm depending on how you use it as well.
Yeah.
And in that consultation, there's so much that you can do as a doctor. And sometimes we feel like prescription is the most effective thing we
Mm.
can do and it's quick. But
Yeah.
actually, it might not be the right solution for a patient.
Yeah.
And taking that time to listen to a patient can help to lift that heavy burden off their shoulders sometimes.
Yeah, very much so. And I think when trainees start out in general practice, mental health is a brand new thing. And well, what do I do when I see someone with mental health? And if I follow them up, what do I do then? And even if you've done a psychiatry job, that's so different to primary care mental health. So my default setting with a new mental health consultation is to actually put no plans in place other than see someone again. Now, there will be times where I will prescribe the first time I see them, or I'll refer for therapy the first time I see them. But I think if you're starting with a base of actually, I'm just getting to know you, we'll probably make a better decision in 2 weeks' time when we follow up. That can be very, very powerful. But then there's also what, what do you do, and what skills can you share with the patient? And when I set out, I remember hearing Tim Cantor speak. He was a psychiatrist, locally retired a bit ago, and he wrote a very helpful book called Depressive Illness, The Curse of the Strong, which is all about burnout and how it's not very often when people burn out, they're often bewildered. They feel, I'm not the sort of person to get depressed. I don't know why this has happened to me, because they believe that if you're strong and you just keep pedaling harder, when the going gets tough, you just pedal harder, then that's all you need to not break. But actually, it's only strong people that take on enough load to eventually break. Um, and it was quite transformative for me to hear him speak and then to read his book. And that really informed my consulting in mental health and my interest in mental health. And one of the things I hope with my book, Your Worry Makes Sense, is that young doctors might read it and find actually this, I hope, is full of tools that they can use, ideas. So, for instance, in one chapter, there's various hints and tips I talk about, and one of them is turning a vicious cycle into a virtuous one. So very often patients recognize that they're in a vicious cycle. Maybe it's pain and depression. The more pain I'm in, the more I get depressed. The more depressed I get, the more pain I'm in. The more pain I'm in, the less I move. The less I move, the more pain I'm in. The more I get fed up because I'm isolated, and everything's just spiraling downwards. And what patients often don't think about is that if you've got a vicious cycle, you must have a virtuous one, because all you need to do is turn around. And it's in the same way as east can't exist without west and up can't exist without down, a vicious cycle cannot exist without a virtuous one. Because if you turn around, things start spiraling in a positive way. So if you can do something a little bit about your low mood, then maybe you feel slightly less pain. If you've just got slightly less pain, maybe you move a little bit more. Maybe that then lifts your mood because you go out on a sunny day and that does you good, which means you're in slightly less pain. And now you're spiraling in the right way. So something like that is a tool that's in my toolkit that I will often share with patients. But you don't come out of medical school with all those tools just in place. And you can very often, I think, as a junior doctor, think, well, I can't do therapy because that takes an hour at a time and I don't have the skills. And so you kind of do nothing, or you don't know where to start. So I'm hoping that the book will help young doctors to shape their own consultations when it comes to mental health, and maybe be a resource for them. And the other thing I think about mental health is education is so important. You know, if we see a patient with pneumonia, they don't have to understand the pathophysiology of pneumonia to get better. They've just got to know they've got to take the antibiotics, pace themselves, and they will get better. But if you've got someone with anxiety, they have to learn about anxiety in order to get better. And that's actually teaching our patients is it's a great privilege and a very rewarding thing to do.
Let's talk about burnout. There is a high rate of burnout among doctors
Yeah.
and also trainers and trainees as well. So tell us about what's been your perspective on it.
Mm. So I think we shouldn't be surprised that there's potentially a higher rate of burnout among doctors, because the sort of people that burn out tend to be people who set high standards. They care about what they're doing. It's important that what they're doing is worthwhile and has a good, a good purpose. They maybe don't delegate very well, either because they just feel very responsible themselves that they should do it, or because they worry about, well, if I ask someone else to do it, they might not do it properly, so they keep it themselves. They're very poor at saying no to something because they don't want to dump on their colleagues, and they have this high sense of responsibility, and also they might be a little vulnerable to criticism, particularly self-criticism. And a lot of doctors, we can be hard on ourselves if we get something slightly wrong, a diagnosis wrong. So all of that potentially means that we're prime for burnout. That doesn't mean we will burn out, but it does mean it's important to recognize that. There's also something that I consider to be a potential multiplier for burnout. So there's the amount of stress in your system, and a certain amount of stress is great. You know, if you don't have any stress at all, you've got no purpose and you don't thrive. So we want some stress. And you can, one of the things I talk about in my anxiety book is how a bit of stress, how well we're doing increases with stress until we get to a point where we're really thriving and it's optimal. And then more and more stress, we kind of level out. Our productivity falls a bit, but no one would notice. And then when we burn out, we fall off a cliff. And the key thing is recognizing when we're getting towards I call it just surviving rather than thriving, but before we fall, and then pulling ourselves back a bit. And one thing that can be a real multiplier for burnout, especially in the caring profession, is something called moral distress, which I don't think is talked enough about by doctors. So moral distress is where you're being asked to do something which is contrary to your values. So it might be that you're trying to help a patient with mental health problems, and they need support, but you can't get that support because they don't meet threshold. Or there's a safeguarding concern, but social services say, again, they don't meet threshold because they're all too stretched. Or someone needs to be seen soon, but the waiting time is a year. And and also sometimes moral distress can be if you're in a bullying environment or you see people being belittled or bullied or, a toxic work culture. Um, so even if you're in a great environment, we all are a bit subject to moral distress because we work in a resource tight area. And particularly when you've got more patients than time in the day and you feel you're not giving your best because you're exhausted, it can multiply to the risk of burnout. So it shouldn't surprise us we're vulnerable. Um, and then the question is, how do you prevent it? um, and a big part of it, I think, is making your week sustainable. I think we can cope with a certain amount of stress in a day. I mean, there's a level of stress where if you're seeing 35, 40 patients in a day, you will feel overwhelmed and a bit panicked at times, and that's not right. And we need to say, actually, there are safe working limits. But also you need sustainability in your week. So for me, I do 3 clinical days. They're pretty intense. But because I then have weekends and 2 days in the week where I'm not in the practice and I can do other stuff like writing or teaching or just in the garden, that makes my week sustainable. There's enough room to breathe in the week. So I think that's really important and probably why most GPs don't do entirely cold-face practice. Maybe they do minor ops or an education role or become a trainer, and that gives a bit of variety in the week, which really helps, I think.
Yeah, it is quite difficult when you're just seeing patients because it is very hard. The type of consultations quite challenging, as you said. The resources are limited, and this patient might need something, but there's no other resources that you could turn to. And in terms of the future of the workforce, do you think that there will be some issues down the line that's going to get worse, or do you think that things might get better? What's your perspective on it?
I think without getting too political, it does depend which party is in power. So I'm a little more hopeful at the moment. The government is making the right noises in terms of saying, look, general practice has been ignored for too long. Um, I think, I mean, there's a huge challenge in general practice, the extra work that we do just because of the changing nature of medicine. When I started, osteoporosis wasn't really a thing that we did anything about. We didn't do DEXA scans. We didn't prescribe alendronic acid. So all those appointments that were to do with osteoporosis didn't exist.
Mm,
And that's just one condition. The amount of women on HRT, it's great. They probably should have had more women on HRT years ago, but it's all extra appointments. ADHD, autism assessments, all these things. That's not due to a political issue, but it's just the changing nature of general practice, isn't it? And it does need to be properly resourced, and that's the struggle.
yeah.
So, I mean, I think the norm probably already is that most GPs work 6 sessions, and people call that three-quarter time, but it's not. It's a 40-hour week because the days are usually 12 hours long, and most then log in for another 4 hours another time, and that's 40 hours in your week. So we need to just be truthful about that and say, actually, that's full time, and that's okay. Um, and but then obviously you need more doctors if people are working 6 sessions rather than 8 sessions like when I started. But I don't think I'd last 6 months doing 8 sessions. Um, and and yeah, I did when I started, but then general practice was different. Some days I would go and have a game of squash in the afternoon. It's unimaginable that you could do that on a work day these days. So we need to make sure that we're able to still enjoy it because it's still a great job and the variety is fantastic. The the connection with the patient, having been in a practice for 23 years, the patients I've known such a long time, and that's very rewarding, and we mustn't let go of that. So there's a lot that's good, and I think one of the problems for like the BMA and the RCGP is the more if they shout too loudly about how much stress we're under, then no one will want to join general practice. It's still a great job, but I think each person needs to make it sustainable while while not losing the joy of what makes general practice good. Because if it becomes entirely transactional, that just, oh, I just come in and I do my job and I don't want to bond, connect with my patients, I can understand that, but it's not very rewarding, I don't think. There's still
Absolutely.
something
I
great
think,
about continuity. And
yeah, I think where you talk about the level of stress and having that right level where you can still perform well, and there's a state of flow where some people get into where they really enjoy what they're doing. It is challenging. However, at the end of the day, you feel satisfied that you've done a great job and you want to do it again. So
yeah.
in terms of the process of writing a second book, were there anything that you did differently this time around? Because you're still working 6 sessions a week, so it's not like an easy job to write a
No,
book.
I think, I mean, it's a very different book because it's for general readership. So that was a new thing. Although both books, they're both very easy to read. They're not simplistic, but they're not a book you'd think, oh, I've got to plow through this. Um, and I really enjoyed the process of writing them. So the biggest difference with the second book was that when I wrote the first book, I stepped down from being a program director. So every Thursday, I was no longer doing that job. Every Thursday, I would just, set myself up in my computer, no other interruptions, and I would just write all day. Um, Whereas I now go and do quite a lot of teaching on Thursdays about the first book. So the biggest difference is the second book took a lot longer to write. It took sort of 4 years to get it all together, whereas the first book, once I decided to write it, I did it within a year. So I'd love to carve out a bit more space. But it does, one of the things about burnout for GPs is recognizing what it is that gives you joy. And for me, creativity has always been an important thing. It took me a long time to realize why this was so important to me. But one of the things, there's so much I love about general practice, the care, the relationship with the patient, feeling you're doing something rewarding. But what you never really do is create something. You never stand back and think, oh, I did that. I made that. Um, and if that's important for you, you need to find another space for that in your life. And for me, for a long time, it was art. I'm a bit of an amateur artist and I've enjoyed drawing and painting, and that would just lift me. Gardening is a creative thing. I've got other hobbies, but for me, writing is a creative process. So it brings me life. And in that regard, if there's something that brings you life, you'll find time for it. I mean, well, I'd encourage you to find time for it, but that's why I can still squeeze it in. Uh,
Yeah.
but I have to be careful. I could burn out as much as anyone, so you've got to be careful.
And what's great about your journey is that you've become a creator now. You're publishing and you're regularly um, recording yourself as well, which is a different way of work nowadays. And we're seeing more people going into being a creator. So
Mm.
how did you learn to become a creator then, Martin?
Yeah, I think I think it's partly this creative urge. I mean, certainly when I started doing reels on Instagram, I wouldn't encourage you to go back and look at the first one I did because it was terrible. I was looking in the wrong place. It was too long. There was nothing very good about it. But you learn through practice, don't you? As I'm sure you've learned with your podcasts and your YouTube channel. I think I love. I love trying to teach things and trying to teach things in a succinct way and a way that involves images. And one of the things about Instagram is a reel on Instagram has to be 90 seconds or shorter. And actually, that was a really good discipline. I think, right, I've got to say this in 90 seconds. And actually, that then, if I can say it in 90 seconds in a reel, probably that's something I can incorporate into a consultation. Whereas if I can only explain it in 20 minutes, that isn't going to work. Um, so I've really enjoyed that challenge. And then you see which reels are responding and which aren't. And so I quite often like getting props out and doing something visual wherever I can think of a visual analogy. And I guess that's just where my brain goes. So I love, but like both books are quite storytelling and using a lot of visual metaphor, which I enjoy and I think people enjoy reading.
You're really good at finding the right metaphor to connect with your audience, especially when you describe these um, mental health issues like burnout. I've seen one of the reels you've done where you're showing a car boot full of
Yeah.
stuff and somebody's trying to find out something and it's so overwhelming.
Yes. Yeah, that one's about burnout, which I talk in the anxiety book as well, actually use that analogy where it's sort of, if you imagine if you're going on, just for your listeners to know what that one's about, it's if you're going on holiday and you pack the boot of your car, almost like a game of Tetris, everything's sort of in its place. And then if you then close the boot and drive on holiday, that's fine. But if you then think, oh goodness, I need the sun cream, it's a major operation to then find the sun cream that's in that suitcase that's buried under this and that. And that's a bit like what it's like when you've overloaded yourself with everything you've got on your plate, that a tiny thing like the equivalent of I need to get the sun cream, which might just be, oh, my email didn't send, or something went wrong when I tried to pay for something on my card, or I got interrupted by the nurse in the middle of my busy day, and you just feel overwhelmed and overloaded, and you either burst into tears, or you snap, or you're irritable, and those are all the signs that you're overloaded and that you might be at risk of burnout if you don't do something. Whereas if you pack your boot 70% full, and then you need the sun cream, quick rummage, got that bag, and here's the sun cream. It's trying to make sure that we've got space in our life to breathe, and I think that analogy people relate to quite well.
So one thing I like to talk about is about how to respond when somebody gets a complaint, and this is one of the worst things as being a doctor. And I remember when I had my first complaint as well, it was quite overwhelming, and
Yeah.
sometimes you feel discouraged because you've seen so many patients, and then that one complaint it gets fixated. You keep thinking about it. So, what's your strategies when you have to deal with these difficult parts of being a doctor?
So in fact, in the last 6 months, I've become the complaints lead in the practice. I think I think a couple of things. One is I would say really value how well you deal with complaints, um, and how well you deal with them as a practice. I think if I was asked, I wanted to evaluate how good an organization was, and I was only allowed to ask one question, I would say, how good are they at dealing with complaints? Because if you when you deal with complaints, people are satisfied with how you dealt with it, that's a really good sign of a good organization. So try, upsetting as they can be, try to see them as an opportunity to prove that you can deal with complaints well. I think even before you get a complaint, one of the main reasons to learn how to be a really good communicator is that it just massively reduces your complaints. People will say, oh, well, I always like to do a scan because I might get told off if or get a complaint if I don't, or this defensive medicine idea. Your best defense from complaints and litigation and unhappy patients is to communicate really well. People feel listened to, then they tend not to want to complain because it's gone well. And one of the big things I talk about in the GP consultation reimagined is the idea of having a dance with the patient, and it's like you're dancing together. And if I talk about all sorts of ways of making sure that dance works well, but if you imagine that you need to be in hold with the patient, in other words, doing everything in unison, checking that you're going in the right direction, then why would you get a complaint? So that's your best defense by far. And then when a complaint comes, I think share it with someone you trust. So I would, I know who I would go to in my practice if I needed to talk about something like that, where I feel I've made a mistake or there might be a complaint, because you want someone who's going to be on your side, but not just belittle anything or ignore what you've done. Our temptation often when we're supporting colleagues say, oh, well, anyone would have done that. Anyone could have missed that. You've done nothing wrong. When actually, that you've not done as best as you could have done, and you're disappointed in yourself, for a good reason. It doesn't mean, you're then catastrophizing to then decide I'm a terrible doctor. Um, and that's the bit you need to stop. But just being unrealistic about the fact that actually, maybe you did miss something, or you weren't on best form that day and you didn't connect with the patient. You want a colleague who can say, you know, there's all these things that are good about you. Yeah. that maybe wasn't quite your best. Let's work on that. Not catastrophize to then conclude everything's terrible about you. Recognize that actually, if you're a doctor for 20 years, you will make mistakes, and you won't get every diagnosis right, and it's a hard job. And then think, okay, what do you need to learn? Is there a process you need to learn? Was it just you hadn't thought about this condition and you need to remind yourself more about it? And most of all, how are you going to respond to the patient, and make sure you respond, not out of anger or frustration or whatever. And who's the best person to respond? And I think very often, if we can do that face to face rather than just write a letter, if you can talk to someone on the phone or see them face to face, you connect with the patient. And that's where you need all your communication skills as well, so that you can diffuse an angry situation. Apologize early. I've never regretted apologizing. Sometimes people think, oh, you're admitting a liability, but I'll always say something like, gosh, something's gone wrong here. I'm really sorry about that. How can we look into this for you? How can we make it right? And take pride in dealing with mistakes wrong. There's a real mistakes well, rather. There's a really good TED talk by Brian Goldberg, he's a Canadian anaesthetist, a great speaker, and it's called "Doctors Make Mistakes. Can we talk about that?" So I'd encourage your listeners to check that out. It's about 90 minutes long, and it's a fabulous TED talk, because we need to be realistic. Often as doctors, we get this impression the way to avoid complaints or mistakes is just to know everything and always, never, ever, ever make a mistake. That's not realistic. You will have sometimes some quite significant diagnoses you miss, and sometimes harm will come as a result, because I worked out one time, it was a scary thought, but I worked out roughly how many appointments I would have in my career, assuming I stayed full time for the whole time, and it was 130,000. Well, I'm not going to get 130,000 consultations right. Even if I get 99.9% of them right, there's still a significant number that I haven't got right. But yeah, complaints are tough.
Yeah. And I think your insight is quite helpful in how to respond to a complaint. Definitely, the time between the complaint and the response makes a big difference. Like if you leave it later, then the patient might not be as forgiving as it would be if you admit something's gone wrong and try and put things right as soon as you can.
Yeah, and I mean, the first thing with a complaint is normally the practice manager or someone would just say, um, acknowledge it and say, and actually, I'll often thank people for complaining, which seems a bit odd, but I'll often say, thank you for pointing this out, actually, because this is how we learn. Um, so even before you investigate, a very well worded, we've received your complaint, thank you for submitting it, we'll take it seriously, we're going to look into it, and this is how we'll respond, is a really good start. So people aren't thinking, well, did they even get it?
Yeah.
So
Tell us what are the key things you've learned while you were writing the book, the last book then?
key things I've learned. I think the role of avoidance. So there are some really good questions to ask patients when they're anxious. And one of the most useful is, what does your anxiety stop you doing that you would like to be able to do? Because avoidance is such a key part of anxiety, whatever that anxiety might be. So you get anxious, you have social anxiety, so you avoid going to parties, for instance, or you make excuses. And that's just an obvious, natural, instinctive thing to do, because our bodies are designed to avoid threat. If the last time you went to the watering hole, this is thinking how we evolved. You got attacked by, or nearly attacked by some lions or something, then you're going to avoid that watering hole next time, or you're going to be very cautious when you go to the watering hole. So avoidance makes sense. It might save your life. But in the 21st century, we can end up avoiding all sorts of things that are not a physical threat to us, like a lion or the tribe next door that's come to attack our village. It's avoiding the supermarket, or avoiding seeing friends and going out for coffee, which are not inherently harmful. Um, so learning whether someone's avoiding something, and also the very many different ways we avoid, because often just not doing the thing is the most obvious way of avoiding, but there are lots of other ways of avoiding. One of the chapters in the book is called Avoidance is Sneaky, Don't Let It Get Away with It. Um, and I look at all the different ways we avoid. So procrastination can be a way of avoidance, and we convince ourselves we're going to do it later, but we never do. Um, Self-medicating with alcohol and drugs. You're avoiding maybe not the thing, maybe you go to the party that you were anxious about, but you avoid the associated anxiety by having a couple of drinks before you get there and getting quite drunk when you're there. Um, the things like OCD, you're avoiding the immediate unease and anxiety and way you feel when you don't do the ritual by doing the ritual. Um, Eating disorders, very often, again, you're avoiding the awful feelings that you have inside by controlling your eating. So there are lots of different ways that people avoid. And as a doctor, very often, if you can just start to help them gain some insights into that. And then the question is, what do you want to do about it? Because it's perfectly reasonable to avoid some things that you'd never want to do. One of the things I talk about in the book is the comfort zone, which is like your green zone, and then your expansion zone, which is amber, and your no-go zone, which is red. So I encourage people to put things in those zones. So you might say, well, my home and my family are my comfort zone. I don't feel anxious there or with them. But going to work maybe and back is my comfort zone. I can do that. But going into the high street in town is not in my comfort zone. I avoid it. That's in my yellow zone, but I'd like to be able to do it. Whereas bungee jumping or traveling to Australia are in my red zone. I'd be too anxious to do them, but I have no current plans to want to do those things, and my life's fine without them. And then the question is, okay, how do you start to push out of your comfort zone into your expansion zone, your amber zone? So if you're frustrated by the fact that you can't go to the high street, how are you going to get there? Is that your most important goal? Is that a goal you're going to work on? Can you break that down into little steps? Maybe the first step is not going shopping there, but allowing your partner to drive you down the high street, and then you go home again. But you just get used to seeing it again and calming, dealing with anxiety. And then maybe you sort of go to the outskirts of the high street and then you go home, or maybe you go into the high street but with someone, and then eventually you build up to being able to just go shopping on your own. So asking patients, is there anything your anxiety is stopping you doing that you want to do? Is a really good question.
That's great. So thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. I'm really grateful that you decided to share these insights, because I think it is going to help a lot of colleagues out there, and also some people struggling with anxiety, which is quite common. So where can people find you?
Yes, thank you. So people can find me on Instagram and TikTok, which is at doc_Martin_GP. I've also got a website, martinbrunet.com. So they can find me on there and then find links to the books. Both books are obviously available online, Amazon, Waterstones, all those sorts of places. But martinbrunet.com and then Instagram and TikTok.
I'll put the link down in the
Yeah.
description. And also, if you want to get the book, Your Worry Makes Sense, make sure you go and get it. It's well written and also very grounded in decades of experience from a GP. So thank you so much. And let us know what you thought about this conversation with Dr. Martin Brunard. Write down in the comment to let us know. Take care, everybody. Bye bye.